afternoon, everyone, and welcome once again to part 2 of Enhancing Your Toolbox. I am so happy to be here with you again for another month, just to talk more about strategies to support children with difficult and challenging behaviors. So before we get started in the meat of the presentation, I just wanted to share a few housekeeping with all of you, especially for folks that was not with us last month. So during the hour that we're going to be together, please feel free to use the Q&A chat. You also will be receiving a certificate at the very end of this session. Please give me at least 1 full week for that certificate to be forwarded to you. Also, because this is a webinar, your devices are muted. So if you have any questions or concerns, you can once again use the Q&A chat, or you can send an email, or you can follow up with questions thereafter, after the webinar. Make sure that you're taking care of you. This is only an hour session. However, I know during that time, things may come up for those of you that are at work. So if you do need to step away from your computer for a few minutes and rejoin, please do so. This webinar is being recorded, so you can always follow up with the information that you may have missed on our YouTube channel, and that information will be shared as well. And for those of you guys that are going to be with us for the length of the hour, I hope you will be able to walk away with at least one additional thing from last month for you to add to your toolbox. And then last but not least, as I just mentioned, just make sure that you're keeping an open mind and try to learn something new throughout the hour. All right, so here's a little bit of information about myself. I am proud to be an educator with over 20 years experience working with children. I actually started my work in Fairfax County Public Schools working with children with disabilities. I got my BA degree in psychology from George Mason University and a master's in education from the University of Phoenix. So I have had the experience both personally and also work related in working with a range of children from birth all the way up to 5, and then also on the side and doing other things. I also dabble with working with school-age children. So I hope the information that I'm going to bring to you today, you can use that information to work with the children that are in your setting and in your care to help them with challenging and difficult behaviors. All right, so what I want you to do now is just take a few minutes for those of you that were with us last month to jot in the Q&A or the chat box of some of the different things that you remember that we discussed last month around difficult and challenging behavior. So I'm just going to give you about 1 minute to do so. I just saw someone that plays challenging behavior always has a reason behind it and can be solved. What about some of the negative labels that we used? We talked about making sure that we are using positive words when we're interacting with children, when we're speaking of children. So we want to make sure that we are always using those positive language and reframing the language that we're using when we're communicating and we're around children. We also talked about the differences between challenging and difficult behavior, which we'll get a little bit more into. And then another thing that we talked about are the triggers that bothers us about children. So a child that may be spitting, a child that may be biting, a child that may be throwing things across the room. Some of those are the triggers that bothers us, but it's something that the child is missing that we need to do. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen with you again. So I do want to thank everyone who did place something in the chat versus what they remember. So let's jump more into some of the things that we talked about last month. So here's something that I just shared, negative labels. And this is a piece that I pulled and shared last month as well. When people are pessimistic, they often view the child's behavior as pervasive and permanent, rather than situational and temporary. So we often have to remember that the behaviors that children typically are displaying are not to hurt us. They are not setting out to offend us in any way. These are behaviors that children are going through because it's developmentally appropriate. So we want to make sure that families and teachers who are pessimistic and they're struggling with these feelings, they need to get the idea of how to be effective change agents. And I'm going to compliment you guys, everyone that's on this webinar this afternoon, by saying this is the first step for you. If you have not yet attended a webinar before with around challenging and difficult behavior, this is a way for you to enhance your toolbox, and hopefully you can help and support the growing needs of the child that may be displaying some of those behaviors. So let's look at this list again. We highlighted here, and oftentimes this child's a troublemaker. They're stubborn, they won't listen, they can't do this, they're always doing this. But we often have to remember that because these are developmentally appropriate behaviors, the expectations that we have set, or some of the different things that we may not have put in place for that child or for a group of children, may be the reason why you're seeing some of these behaviors and then you're using these labels for the behavior that they're demonstrating. So I want to caution everyone of when you're speaking about a child, when you're interacting with a child, to reframe your language and to avoid these words or these phrases as much as possible. So I think this is where we left off on ensuring that when we're interacting with children and when we're speaking about children, we're refraining from using these negative labels. So going back to what I mentioned earlier, we also want to make sure that we're reframing the language that we're using with children. So instead of saying the child is bad, we can write it, or we can also say the child requires more support. If the child is being annoying, instead of saying that, you can say the child is very vocal, they're assertive. If the child, as you may view as being a troublemaker, the child is active and involved. And when we do that, we start seeing the child or a group of children in a more positive light instead of the negative way that we often see children. Because as someone already mentioned, it's the way that children are displaying things is because there's a lack of maybe the environment. There's things in the environment that they may need. There's things that we're not offering them as a caretaker or the educator. So we want to make sure that what we're saying and what we're doing with children is always positive. So here's an example that I created. So when we're thinking about positive language, when we use positive and objective language, so objective for others that may not know the definition, is you're writing and you're saying exactly what you see and you hear. You're taking your judgment out of what the child is displaying. So we want to make sure that we're describing and giving more meaning and context to the situation and the behavior. The reason for this is because we want to make sure that when you do have conversation with families, or you do have conversation with your principal, your administrators, or whomever, you want to give them or paint a picture, a very clear picture of what the child is demonstrating. So if you look at the example on this page, it says, always kicking. But instead of saying that, you can say the child kicked 3 times in a 5-minute sit-in. So while you're sitting maybe for story time with a child for 5 minutes, they have kicked 3 times. That way it's very clear of what happened during that story time. The child never listened. So instead of saying that, you can say, I remind the child 80% of the time to pick up toys. Or you can say, I provided 10 reminders before the child began to pick up their toys. I also do want to point out that oftentimes, and I find myself doing this as well, as I mentioned, I am still in this process of learning because I also do have toddlers myself. And as a parent, sometimes the knowledge that we have or have gained sometimes go out the window when we're working with our own children, but we always have to keep that in the forefront of our mind. So when we're talking about reminders, I often remind my sons of things to do instead of giving them a warning. So once again, it goes back to the wording or the choice of wording that we're using. Instead of saying, I am warning you to pick up your toys. I am warning you that if you don't do this, then this will happen. I am reminding you. This is a reminder that let's pick up your toys, or your toys do need to go back in the toy bin. When you do that, the child is more receptive to carry out that direction or that expectation that you have of them. Another thing that I also want to point out for reminders, typically you're only supposed to give a reminder twice, and then on the third attempt, then you go towards that child and move them in the direction of where you want them to be and what you want them to do. So if we're still using the example of the child not picking up their toys, what you could do is say, Billy, go ahead and pick up your toys. It's almost time for lunch. And Billy's continuing playing with his toys. Billy, we have 2 more minutes until lunch. Go ahead and start picking up your toys. If you notice at that time, the child is still continuing to play with the toys. At that third attempt, you need to move closer to the child and start helping them picking up their toys, put in the bin, and start getting ready for lunch. And what tends to happen when we do that is the child is being reminded of what is expected of them. And you are on the child's level instead of being across the room yelling at the child of what they need to do. We always have to remember the age of the child and what their capacity is. So we always need to meet the child where they are. One of the slides that I talked about last month was a piece that it was a research that was done by the Foundation of Child Development that specifically highlighted that boys were expelled at a rate of over 4.5 times of that of girls. And the possible meaning why this may be happening is that for young boys, young children, when we're looking at their capabilities and what they can and cannot do, boys are innately active. They are usually jumping, and they're always, as we usually hear, they're always getting into things. But that's in their nature, that's built in their DNA. The individuals that's working with them, whether it's a family member, whether it's an educator, they often don't understand these behaviors that children, especially boys, are demonstrating. So we as educators, as caregivers, need to take that time and that understanding to find out why that child is behaving in the way they are. It has nothing to do with that child has ADHD or ADHD or some other disability or special needs, but oftentimes this is just who they are and they need that outlet. So when we are noticing that a child is jumping off of something constantly, we create activities for them to make sure that we're supporting that need. Take them out on the playground several different times throughout the day. Make sure that you're doing a nature walk and so on and so forth to help support that behavior or that drive that they have that they're not being able to release because they're being forced to sit down and behave like girls. And then there's that stereotype, especially when it comes to Black and Hispanic boys, where they are seen more aggressive. And when we look at television shows, when we look at the media, when we look at, a lot of things that are written about Black boys, especially, they are being painted in a negative light of being aggressive. So as educators, as caregivers, we need to start nurturing those different skills, and especially the positive skills that the children are exhibiting to help foster some of those different skills that we know that they may be struggling with, or that's their area of growth. Here's also a set of pictures that I shared last month as well, where it highlights some of the behaviors that we see on a regular basis. These are behaviors that children exhibit day to day, week to week, month to month. And for when we're talking about our toddlers, sometimes we see this multiple times out the day. But I often want everyone to remember that when children are exhibiting these behaviors, they're doing it because it's developmentally appropriate. They are still trying to figure themselves out. They're still trying to figure out their world. And when they're displaying these behaviors, it's their way of saying, please help me. I don't know what else to do. This is the only skill that I have. I'm going to cry. I'm going to bite. I need you to help me figure this out. But when we sit back and say, no, you're in timeout, or you're not going to play with this toy, or you're not going to go on the playground, we're not really fostering that need. So I want to make sure that everyone, instead of putting a child in timeout or instead of taking something away from them, try to figure out the different ways that you can help foster that need that they have. So when we're looking at the picture at the very top of the screen of the two boys that may be fighting, definitely separate them, have that conversation with both boys separately of why that altercation happened, and then together come back and try to see if they can solve the problem together or come up with some form of solution. Children at a very early age can problem solve. We just have to give them the language and then model for them of how to best problem solve certain situation that's going to come up. But I've seen it often where things are taken away from children, or they're being separated and not given the room to talk about how they're feeling and the reason why they felt the way they're feeling. So make sure that children are also getting that room to explain some of the different things that may be happening with them. Here's another example that I shared last month of Emma, who constantly keep going to the bathroom at bedtime. And every time she's taken to the bathroom, she doesn't use the bathroom. She goes back to her room. She asks to use the bathroom again, and that cycle is repeated over and over again. And for those of you guys that were on last month, I shared the story of my little one locking himself in the bathroom. I cannot really say that's got any better, but it's gotten a little better. I can actually say that. So now he thinks it's just really funny to lock himself in any room, and I'm going to lock the door. So I'm now getting to the point of, once again, following up with him and sharing the importance of not locking the door, because if there's an emergency, and then walking away and then having, once again, to problem solve and figure out the reason why he shouldn't be in the bathroom by himself with the door locked, and then come out the bathroom when it's necessary. So when we're talking about little Emma, we want to consider some of the different things of, why is she constantly going to the bathroom? Is there something that you're overlooking or we're overlooking of why this is happening? So some of the possible meaning of why Emma may want to go to the bathroom so many times throughout the night is that she may not want to go to sleep, plain and simple. Just like a lot of us, it may be 9, 10 o'clock at night, or maybe 1, 2 o'clock in the morning, and you're just wide awake. It may just be the same thing for Emma. But instead of her articulating that or sharing that with her caregiver or maybe her teacher, she's constantly going to the bathroom or requesting to go to the bathroom. She may also be missing you. So she knows that when she goes to sleep, close her eyes, she's not going to see you for several hours. And she may just want that time just to hold on to you just a little bit more. So it's that conversation of having with her of, can you share with me, if this is a child that has the language to share with you, of why she does not want to go to sleep. And maybe you'll be very surprised of her saying, I just want to be next to you and I don't want to go to sleep because I'm going to miss you. And that's also okay. But you, instead of us forcing children to go to sleep, I often recommend to educators to make this a rest time. And going back to the story of my little one, and I'm going to constantly bring up my children because, as I said, I'm in that process of learning and growing as well. I found out about like 6 months ago, he is not an afternoon napper. He just does not go to sleep. And for a while, I got to a point where, Mike, you need to rest. You had a long morning. You got up at 6 o'clock this morning. It's now 1:30. Why are you not going to sleep? But I got to a point where I realized that he just does not want to sleep in the afternoon. So we do have that conversation while he's eating his lunch, while we're on our way upstairs to his bedroom. while we're in the bathroom getting prepared for his rest time, and so on and so forth. So there's different reminders or different things that are set up and put in place to let him know that if you don't want to go to sleep, that's okay. But if you are going to stay in your room and play, I do need you to remain quiet and play because your brother is also sleeping. So that's something that we can do as well, especially for if you're in a classroom with 14, 16, 20 children, and you do have those 1 or 2 children that are not an afternoon napper. You can give them that language, or you can give them substitute things to do instead of napping, because not everyone naps in the afternoon. Now, when it comes to nighttime, a child is just going to fall at some given point, but it shouldn't be that hard. You have to close your eyes at 8 o'clock. As long as you have your evening routine of putting that child down, they're in their room or they're in their space to go to sleep for the night. As long as they're there, they're comfortable, it's safe. I'll say walk out and let that child fall asleep naturally on their own. Okay. Another reason why Emma may not want to go to sleep is that her bed may be uncomfortable. The cot may be uncomfortable. The blanket that is there for her may be itchy. So there's a lot of things that we, once again, can substitute out just to try to find out what are the reasons why she does not want to go to sleep. And then she may also have a problem with her bladder. And if this is the case, of course, that's not something that we will be able to notice right away. But if you're documenting this over time and going back to the ABC chart that I shared last month and will share again this webinar, these are things that can be documented. And if you are suspecting that Emma is having problems with her bladder, of course, notifying a family member and then letting the family member to know to get in contact with her pediatrician. For if you are a family member yourself and this is your child, then of course contacting your pediatrician and seeing if there's something that they can recommend for you to do to support her during bedtime. Okay. So let's jump into the definition of challenging and difficult behaviors for individuals that were not here last month. And then for those of you guys that were here last month, this is just a recap of the definition. So for a behavior to be defined as challenging, it has to interfere with a child's cognitive, social, and emotional development. It also has to be harmful to the child, other children, and adults. And it put the child at further risk for problems in school and for failure. So we always all want to consider these 3 different categories of how we're labeling a behavior. Now, when we look at a difficult behavior, it's a behavior that's temporary. So a child that may just come up and bite you once, but never bite you again, that's a difficult behavior. It may interfere with the child's social development. And as you can see, if you're looking at this list, it's temporary, it may interfere, and it occurs in a particular environment or situation. So it's just in one environment, not the full scope all the way across the board that this child is demonstrating these behaviors. And then the last one on this list is likely to improve without interventions. So there's no intervention that needs to be done by you or a specialist or maybe the educator, but this is just, once again, a typical developing behavior that's just going to go away on its own. Just like I'm thinking about my son not being a napper, a typical behavior that at any given point, whether it's now or whether he's turned 4 years old, 5 years old, it's like, you know what, I love to sleep. Let me sleep in the afternoon. Or, he may just stop next week and locking himself in the bathroom door. But I know there's going to be something else that follows that. So we just have to keep that in our mind, that these are cycles and these are processes that the children tend to go through to figure out who they are and to discover their world. Here's a side-by-side view of when we're talking about difficult and challenging behavior. So for difficult behavior, it's an occasional pinching or pushing, but when you're talking about a challenging behavior, that child is frequently punching and hitting. The misuse of materials can be seen as difficult, but a child destroying materials is challenging. When a child is not talking or participating in group activities, that's difficult. But when a child is timid and withdrawn, that can be seen as challenging. So once again, it goes back to the wording, and if there's intervention that's needed, and if there's intervention that's needed, that's challenging. If there's no intervention that's needed, then that's difficult. Here's a chart that I spoke a little bit about, which is the antecedent, behavior, and consequences. And this is an ABC chart that can be used over a period of time just to capture the child's behavior. When I spoke about this last month, I referenced that you guys, when you are using this chart, to make sure that you're using it for an extended amount of time. So not just a week and you capture a few things and say, oh, this child needs intervention, we need to do something, or there's that this child has a disability. I do want to caution everyone on this webinar, including myself, that we are not pediatricians, we're not psychologists, so we cannot diagnose a child. All we can do is to record using this form, or if you have something else that's useful, or record what the child is doing and how you're responding and the child's responding to what you're doing, to make sure that we're then passing that information on to maybe a psychologist to analyze if there's other things that needs to be done for that child. So for the antecedent is what happens before the behavior, what led to the behavior. There's always something that's happening before the behavior occur. And I often see where, when in conversation with educators and family members, you're saying, oh, the child just came up and bit me. Let's think about that. Did you say something to the child prior to that? Did someone do something to them, 2 minutes ago or 30 seconds ago for them to now realize that I want that toy, or I don't like what was shared, so I'm now going to bite you. But there's always something that happens prior to a behavior. And then the behavior is just the behavior. Going back to what I said before, you want to be very objective in recording what you are observing that child is doing. So you're being very, very clear. The child kicked, and he or she kicked for 5 minutes. And then the consequences. How did you respond to the behavior afterwards? And then how did the child respond? So here's a scenario that I created that I want us to think about when we're talking about challenging behavior. So it's called swing dancing, and I hope everybody can figure out why it's called swing dancing. So every day at 11:30, Jason looks out his classroom window at the other children as they play on the playground. And it's supposed to say Jason, but I switched the names. So Jason would frequently run out his classroom and onto the schoolyard. Once there, he would jump on the swing. He repeated this behavior approximately 5 times each day. When his teacher tried to lock the door to his classroom, he would make a break for the library area and jump on the hammock hanging in the corner. So when we're thinking about the antecedent, can anyone put in the chat what they think the antecedent of this scenario is? Thank you. And someone said, watching the other children play. Absolutely. So every day at 11:30, he noticed that there's other children playing. So because he wants to go outside, that is the antecedent of that behavior. Why are they on the playground? I want to be on the playground as well. How do I get to go to the playground? And then the behavior, of course, is Jason running out of the classroom to go onto the playground. Now, I want us to think, what could be the best course of action for us as a consequence to support Jason's behavior? So go ahead and use the chat again. So we already identified the antecedent. We already know the behavior. What will be the consequence? Okay. Thank you. I see someone say give Jason reminders, and thank you for using that word, reminders. So absolutely, you can remind Jason that the other children on the playground, and remind him of the time that he and his classmates will be on the playground. If you are at home with your children, you can also remind your child of, okay, we're going to take a walk after you wake up from your nap, or we're going to take a walk or go on the playground after we have lunch. Whatever the situation is, reminding Jason of what needs to be done before he can go out to the playground. Another thing that you can do, if it's built into your day or into your schedule or into your time, maybe take him out on the playground during that time as well. If it's not going to interrupt anything that he's doing or that he's learning at that moment, take him out to the playground to interact with those children if they're, the same age group of children that as he is. And then I would also suggest that because he's running for the door, because he's running out of the classroom, to make sure that you have the conversation with Jason prior to 11:30. So when you know that that clock is going to hit like 11:28, 11:29, sit down with Jason and talk about, okay, so we know that 11:30, some of your friends are going to be on the playground. What do we usually do during this time? You can sit by the window and you can watch them play, or you can ask Miss Shauna if you can go out to the playground. So that way you're reminding him of what's to come. And then you're also giving him that preparation of, these are some of the different things that I can do to help me in this moment. And it's also helping you as well. And I know oftentimes we do get busy throughout the day, but we know we want to interrupt some of the behaviors that Jason may exhibit. So in order to do that, you have to set your clock prior to 11:30. Because if not, he more than likely will run out the classroom or run out the house or wherever you are. Okay, so thank you for sharing your thoughts in the chat. So let's analyze the behavior a little bit more. So when we're talking about step 2 of looking at the antecedent behavior and the consequences, we want to make sure that we know when the behavior is happening, how often, with whom, where. So I mentioned this last month and I'll say it again. In order for you to really know the difference between a difficult and a challenging behavior, I want you to think about the intensity, the duration, and the frequency. And I'll talk a little bit more about that, but definitely keep that in mind. And here you do see it on this slide where it talks about the intensity. So when we're looking at the duration, how long is the behavior happening? Is it ongoing for a total of 45 minutes, or it's just 20 seconds or a minute? And we can use a scenario of a child that's crying. Is a child really crying for 45 minutes total, or it's the intensity? And I hope using these examples, it can help frame when you're looking at the different behaviors that children are exhibiting, of how to determine if it's versus a difficult behavior or a challenging behavior. So is it a light drizzle or a downpour? Once again, we're talking about crying here as an example. Is it a downpour versus a tropical storm? Is it a tropical storm or a hurricane? Is it a hurricane or a tsunami? And it goes back to being very objective with what you're writing and how you're framing what the child is doing. So if you can keep these in the back of your mind of how to frame what the child's doing, you'll get a better picture of that behavior over time. Now, when we're looking at the frequency, is the child crying during drop-off, pickup, and throughout the day? or just one of these three? Is a child only crying on the playground, but doesn't cry during lunchtime or when you take them to the grocery store? Is a child crying with you, their teachers, and other family members? So these are the duration, the intensity, and the frequency can definitely help highlight what the child's doing, what it looks like, to help you prepare for the child and best support them moving forward. And step 3 in analyzing the behavior, we want to make sure that we understand it. So does a child need the attention from you or from others? Are they demonstrating that behavior because they're trying to escape or avoid something? And remember, we all do that. Even as adults, we seek attention, we escape and we avoid. We look for something that's tangible, and we also seek out sensory input. We all have that need that we need to get stimulated. So in the same exact thing for children more so than adults, because they're not yet able to articulate. At least I can say, I don't want to do this. For many of you on this webinar, if you feel like you don't want to be on this webinar anymore, you'll click the stop or exit. For a child, they'll throw themselves on the floor, they'll cry, they'll run out the building, because they may not yet have the language to say, I don't want to be here, or I don't like this. So we have to help them and give them that language of how to share what's going on. Once again, if they don't have the language, maybe offering for them to draw how they're feeling. Maybe they can act it out. There's so many different things that you can do to help a child demonstrate how they're feeling. So dig in that toolbox that you already have and pull out some of those creative things that you have used before in the past and that you may be able to use with this particular child that's demonstrating a behavior. Here's some strategies, and I'm not going to go through all of it, but we were just talking about escaping and avoiding. So an inappropriate strategy here will be allow the child to escape. So when we're thinking about Jason that was running out the room because he saw his classmates or saw other friends on the playground, in order for us to support him or provide the appropriate strategy, we can redirect him. As I mentioned, you can anticipate the child escaping. So 1128, 1129. You can also do a social story. And a social story is just you creating a story just for that child based on that behavior that they're exhibiting. So you can use index cards, and I'll show more about social stories next month, because next month when we come together, we'll do a deep dive. You guys will be able to see all the different strategies that I've mentioned last month and this month, and just bring them all together. So a social story, once again, is just a quick story that you're creating that you can read prior to and after a behavior has occurred to help best support that child. It should also be available for the child to use at their leisure. If you are an educator working with children, you can share this with the family as well. Make a copy for that child to have at home. If you're a family member, you can create your own. So it doesn't have to be anything fancy. You can take pieces of paper, fold it, just write it out, make sure you're having pictures. And I usually suggest making sure that you're using real pictures of the child and not the animated ones. Once again, we'll talk a little bit more about that. And then one thing I do want to point out is also the sensory. So as I mentioned, we all need that sensory input. For a child that may be kicking a table over and over again, and that is your trigger, that's your hot button, making sure that you're providing them with an alternate source of sensory input. So do you have a place set up where that child can jump? So they're still using their legs, they're still getting that sensory input? Or can you give them something else? Maybe you can attach a ball at the very bottom of the table where the child can kick the ball instead of the table. So just think about some of the different things that you can put in place to give that child the same motion of kicking their legs or using their legs but it's not as triggering for you. But you want to make sure that you're meeting that need for the child. So here's some possible reason why some of these behaviors may be happening. The behavior is an approach to a situation or a task that the child is approaching or exploring and attempting to master. Once again, they're exploring their world. I'm going to try to do this just to see how it feels or what it feels like. So they're not doing it to manipulate you or to drive you crazy. They're really trying to figure out why. And the clues are the child may be in a new or unfamiliar situation. So oftentimes we see more behavior pop up when the child is in a new classroom, there's a new teacher, you may have switched around the setting. Any little changes may impact how a child respond or behave. And an action that you can do is provide opportunities for the child to explore. So if you did change around your classroom setting, and for those of you that are educators and we're thinking about the holidays and maybe when the children are coming back, you're going to add something new or take something out of your program, then instead of all the children just coming in just like, whoa, 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 what is all this? My suggestion to you would be when they come in for the morning, walk them around to the different interest areas or the centers in your program and talk about what's there, what they can use, how they can manipulate it, how they can, use it with their friends, by themselves, and so on and so forth. That way, it's not so overwhelming right off the bat. And you're giving them the opportunity to explore on their own or with a partner about some of the different things that you have taken away and also have added for them to just warm up to the situation. And I'll also want you to think about when you're going to a place that's new, a lot of times we end up reverting to ways that looks very similar to how children demonstrate behaviors. We don't talk to others, or we're overly friendly, or we're just talking a million miles per hour. I mean, it's the same exact thing for children. They may shut down or they're getting into a lot of things because, oh, this is new, this is foreign to me. So of course I'm going to do these things. I also want to point out that the general environment, since we're talking about that, is also very, very key. So your environment is your third teacher. So keep that in mind of when you're creating your space for children, it should be a very calm and very friendly space for them to explore on their own with a partner and sometimes with you. If you have clutter in your space, whether it's at home or in your classroom, that can enhance a child's behavior. So some of the different things that we can do is to declutter. We can invite the children to help create the environment. Other things you can do is focus on the child rather than the behavior. And I was in a webinar a few months ago where the facilitator shared, you must focus on the donut. Focus on the donut and not the hole. The hole is the problem. The donut is the child. And there's just like that little piece that needs support, that needs to be nurtured, that needs to grow. But oftentimes we focus on that whole of why are they doing this? I can't believe this is happening. Da, 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 da. Instead of looking at the whole child and say, well, they're demonstrating this skill. I know he works with, partners very well. He's kind. So going back to reframing your language and using positive words when you're talking about children. So here's a quote of the day. For better or worse, toddlers' most frustrating behaviors are usually quite normal and developmentally appropriate. 0 to 3. So regardless of how we see the behavior, it's quite normal. And it's okay. We just have to find the tools to best support them. We just have to find ways, whether it's joining a webinar like this, reading articles, participating in conferences, to find out different strategies to help our little ones. But we have to be there for them. They cannot be punished for demonstrating developmentally appropriate behaviors. So let's reflect on what we talked about, because we only have 10 more minutes. Wow, an hour went by that quickly. So consider the following as you work with young children. So make sure that you're constantly building the relationship between you and the child and their family members. It's not just you by yourself on an isolated island. Make sure that you're also addressing one behavior at a time. So if a child is biting, if they are screaming, if they're kicking, you can't tackle all three all at once. So going in and using your ABC chart to figure out which of those behaviors out of those three is really detrimental, which is really challenging. And that's the one that you're going to tackle. And oftentimes what happens with the support that you're given, with the support of the family or with a team, those support will end up bleeding over into the other two behaviors that you have noticed, and that will subside, or those will subside. But you can't tackle all behaviors at once, because you're going to get overwhelmed. You're going to lose track of what support you're putting in place and who's doing what. So just do it one at a time. And always go back to your ABC chart. Connect with your special ed providers and ask for help. So help in the form of reaching out to a colleague, help in the form of reaching out to me, help in the form of just reading something new that's pertaining to this topic. And always remain open-minded. And I cannot emphasize enough, children are not doing this to hurt us. They're doing this because they're trying to figure it all out for themselves. We're trying to figure it all out for ourselves. And oftentimes we do things that mimic what children are doing. So stay open-minded to the process, stay open-minded about the length of time that it's going to take. Please remember that when you are working with children, especially when it comes to challenging and difficult behavior, you may not see any progress until like the 4th week, the 5th week, and sometimes even longer. So give it time. Nothing happens overnight. And it's about that consistency. So making sure that you're constantly putting that in place. And that's why building that relationship with the families, having a team of folks that are behind you to support you is going to be helpful, because with that consistency, then you guys can start seeing the growth of the child. I shared this last time that we were together, but I'm going to share it again. Making sure that the tools that you have is working. So a tool is only as good as its user. So make sure that you use the tools that you have. Use the tools that you gained from this webinar last month. And I'm hoping that you guys walked away again today with something new that you can add to your toolbox of what you can do to best support that child. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to look to see if there's any questions in the chat. If you guys can pose your questions. And I just noticed that someone says, I like the description for the behaviors. So thank you for that. So keep in mind that when we're working with children, with difficult and challenging behaviors, oftentimes we have to step back and look at what bothers us. What are our triggers? And that form that I sent out last month, I'll send it out again. So expect an email from me no later than tomorrow with the ABC chart as well as with the hot buttons chart. And I do want you to take the time to go through and just write down what are things, being honest with yourself. What are things that just drive me crazy? And this is your chart. So you can put down whatever you want. So if it is spitting, if it is biting, put that down. And then also on the chart, it says, what are some of the different things that you can do to start doing to best support the child? Okay. And then add those to your toolbox. Try them, and if they're working, add them to your toolbox. Someone just said, thank you for a recap on how to redirect and remind children ahead of time of the behaviors that they're displaying. So thank you. Yes, and it's once again, it's about the wording, reminding a child versus warning children. So you're giving them multiple reminders, 2 reminders, and then you go over and guide them to what they need to do. Okay, so here are some of the upcoming sessions. So next month we are going to be, it's going to be set up more like a panel. Myself and one other individual that's going to be sharing some different strategies with you, hands-on strategy that you can use. And I'm hoping during that time you guys will ask questions about, some of the different things that you are noticed on a day-to-day, because you are on the ground working with children all the time. So come with your questions. If you want to send me questions ahead of time, you can do that as well, so I can prepare some different examples to show you what you can do. If you don't want that, or if you don't have the time to send me those questions ahead of time, that's perfectly fine as well. And then I can just share all that information with you. On January 12th, we are going to be doing a learning lab. So this is an opportunity for us to come together and just learn from each other. We all have different tricks and tools that we're using with our little ones. And I want us as a cohort to share some of the different things that you are using to best support children. So hopefully you guys will join me in January around some of the different tools that you guys are using to support children with difficult and challenging behavior. And I'm going to end today by sharing my information. So if you are not yet following me on social media, on Instagram and also Facebook, you can find me at Early Nelson Learning. And then my website is earlynelsonlearning.com. So make sure that you guys are following me. I will also send the YouTube link for this video for those of you guys that want to recap the information that was shared. And hopefully the recording did capture the first couple of slides that were not shown. If not, I'll see if I can redo it and upload that to my YouTube channel. In the meantime, if you have any questions or concerns about this presentation, as well as the webinar from last month, please send me an email or reach out to me on my Facebook, Instagram, or my website for additional information. Okay, and I want to thank everyone for joining us today, and I look forward to seeing you next month. Thank you.